Welcome to the Proceedings podcast. I'm Bill Hamblet, the editor-in-chief of Proceedings at the U.S. Naval Institute. Today is Friday, the 28th of February, end of the second month of the year, 2025. Good to have you on board, everybody. It is a nice sunny day here in the Annapolis area. This episode is brought to you by Booz Allen, delivering outcomes with speed for the nation's most critical defense priorities. Work with solution engineers who use AI, cyber, and quantum to help warfighters collaborate faster with allies and partners from the open seas to the edge of space. Learn more at boozallen.com/defense. All right, joining me today is my guest, Marty Bollinger. He's the author of one of the shipbuilding articles in the February issue of Proceedings. It's titled Shareholder Interests Are at Odds with Navy Needs. If you have the print issue at home, you can find it on pages 28 and 29. Marty, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Bill. Glad to be here.
All right. So your article takes a look at shipbuilding from a very different perspective from the other articles that we've got in the February issue. You look at Wall Street and how investors view the companies that build naval ships and submarines. Before we dive into the details, I just want you to tell our listeners a little bit about your background, your experience and qualifications that allowed you to write this piece.
Sure. I think my first qualification is that I've been around for a while. I've been looking at the defense industry for 40 years, and the first 30 of which as a consultant with Booz Allen. I was a senior partner leading their global defense industry practice, worked with naval shipbuilders in the US, Europe, as far as Australia, primarily helping them achieve the objectives being set to them by their shareholders. And so working with the C-suites and the boards on their underlying strategies. Retired from that 10 years ago, spent the last 10 years as an executive lecturer at the Darden School at the University of Virginia, running sessions and classes and lectures dealing with defense industrial base issues, primarily for the flag officers in the Navy and the Marine Corps. And over the past year or so, I've been giving a lot of advice to all the PEOs involved in naval shipbuilding, team submarines, small, unmanned small combatants, PEO ships, on how to deal with some of the challenges they find in industry. So I've been around watching this business for quite some time.
Nice. And you're also an amateur naval historian of some stature. So you've written for not just Proceedings now, but you've also written for Naval History Magazine.
And the Naval Institute Press, 2 books.
And the press, that's
so
right.
I have the trifecta. I love history, and I think understanding history, particularly in an industry like this one, can shed a lot of light on what we're seeing now if you understand the context where it comes from.
Yeah, and your article includes a lot of that context. It goes back to, just after the Cold War. Well, really, it starts in the Cold War with the structure that we had for shipbuilding during the Cold War, and then how that changed. So just recap some of that post-Cold War history about how companies that build ships for the Navy, how they transformed, how they merged, how they consolidated, and maybe a little bit of the why.
So, the fundamental U.S. industrial base in defense is an outcome of the Second World War, when if you were a big industrial company, you became a defense contractor. And many of them stayed with it afterwards. And there were 2 real reasons why big companies like to be in defense. One was there was an opportunity for technology transfer, commercial satellites, space launch, computers. Raytheon invented the radar range, which became the microwave oven. So companies that had big commercial businesses liked the idea of being in defense for that technology transfer. And we still see that today in things like AI and robotics and cyber, not so much in the big old industrial businesses like shipbuilding. The second reason was that defense was a counter-cyclical business. The US government would stimulate the economy during recessions, primarily by pumping money into building ships and planes. And so there was a company, Congolium, which made wood flooring products and other products for houses and buildings. And whenever a recession happened and its housing business collapsed, it was lucky to also own Bath Iron Works, because the money then would support frigate construction and destroyer construction.
Wow. That
again began to break down as we no longer saw defense as the only means to stimulate the economy in recessions. So about 20 years ago, investment in businesses in defense began to change. Investors didn't need corporate executives to manage their diversity for them. They could do it in their own portfolios. And so there was a lot of pressure to break up these conglomerates. Ingalls was owned by a company that also made Stouffer foods and typewriters. Newport News was owned by a company that made farm tractors and operated natural gas pipelines. That all came apart.
Yeah.
The problem then is when a defense business became its own entity, investors started looking at it in a more specialized role, which was, don't worry about growth. Don't worry about high risk. I can get that elsewhere. What you have uniquely is the ability to generate cash. And investors began to demand more and more of that from the defense industry, and they're the owners. So the defense industry responded. I want to make clear, though, if I can, real quick, 2 points. One is I'm talking about naval shipbuilding. It's a very unique business. I'm not talking about defense buying IT or software or drones.
Right.
That behaves differently. And I'm also not trying to point the finger at any bad actors. This isn't a case where there's malfeasance going on. These are people doing the smart thing for their own interests, which when put together collectively yields an outcome that's not optimal for the U.S. Navy.
I think I want to foot stomp that last point, because last fall we reached out to a number of potential authors. All of them are now in that February issue of Proceedings, and we have more coming. And we said, look, there's a problem with shipbuilding. Shipbuilding for the Navy, it's largely broken, and it's evidenced by the fact that for the last 10 plus years across several different presidential administrations, didn't matter whether it was a Republican or a Democrat in the White House, they all said they wanted to grow the Navy. They all said they set targets for 355 or 381 or some large number of ships, much larger than we have today. And the number has been stuck at 290 to 295 to just under 300. I think it's about 295 today. All right. So despite the desire, the political desire, the stated political desire to grow the Navy hasn't been able to grow. And there's been lots of problems with shipbuilding, and we did not want people, and your article doesn't. We did not want people to point fingers and say, well, it's this fault or that, that actor's fault. And your article, I think, just does a terrific job of looking at the business side. So post-Cold War, the demand signal went down. And as you pointed out, industry changed and investment habits changed. And so the incentive structure changed, right? And so this isn't about, the money grubbing, greedy defense contractors. That's not it at all. And that's not what your article says. It basically, sort of charts the course of those incentive structures and business decisions that were logical ones, and to some extent, Navy and congressional decisions that made sense for the day, right? That made sense when the Cold War went away and the Russian Navy went back to its home ports and rested at the pier. And our Navy was, we had 600 ships almost 1986 and didn't need 600 ships navies, right? And then we had the post 9/11 era where we were suddenly involved in two wars, Iraq and Afghanistan. And the Navy became a supporting actor to the Army and the Marines. And those wars that were projected originally to be quick and over, rapidly, stretched on for a long time. And that impacted the money available to build ships, et cetera, right? So we find ourselves where we are for lots of good reasons. And I don't think that it's a story of malfeasance or bad decisions, over the last 30 years. But we are where we are, and it's going to take a lot of efforts to unravel this Gordian knot that we're kind of in. And I think your article is really important because most people in the Navy would never look at the shipbuilding problem from the perspective that you did. And it's it's a really unique article in the shipbuilding package that we have. And a lot of people have let me know that they loved it because they're like, I never thought about that aspect of this problem. So anyway, I just want our reader, if you haven't read it yet, you got to read it. But I also want you to know that Marty did a terrific job of it's not pointing fingers. It is an explainer of this is how this happened through business decisions, investment decisions, that made sense to people, at the time. Anyway, that's a long soliloquy on my part, but I thought it was very important to point that out.
It is, and the things we see happening here are not confined to naval shipbuilding. They apply to most large, heavy industry, long product life cycle capital goods markets. It's not just in naval shipbuilding. But the other thing I wanted to do in the article was introduce the concept of risk. People talk about profitability and the returns. And that's really important. But the reality is people will invest in treasury bills with a return of 1%, and they're happy to do it. And the reason is the risk is low. Venture capitalists will invest in businesses with a very high risk, where there's a 90% chance of getting nothing. They are willing to do that because the return is exceptionally high.
Yeah.
And what you need to do is look at naval shipbuilding in that context. The returns, though, are effectively capped, right? You're not going to generate primary demand. Newport News is not going to come up with a new design and have it in Walmart in time for Christmas. It's just not how it works. It's a long cycle, threat-driven, budget-driven process. You can't generate primary demand. Margins are also effectively capped, right? I mean, if you start making margins like NVIDIA of 40 or 50% on sales, you'll be hauled in front of Congress, and probably for good reason. So if you can't give an extraordinarily high return, the logical thing for investors to do is want to lower your risk.
Yeah.
And that's what we've seen the industry do. And it's a perfectly logical response to the kind of investor demands that logical investors give to industry. But to lower risk, the first thing you do is you want to try to reduce your market risk. You don't want to suddenly facilitize for a set of ships that doesn't arise. And here, unfortunately, our nation's track record is not all that good. We're going to build 29 Seawolves. No, it's actually going to be 12. Well, no, maybe it's 7, and it turns out to be 3. We're going to build, 30-some DDG 1000s, down to 3.
Right. Yeah.
So industry is getting signals about our future shipbuilding intentions that cause them to create capacity for the known demand, the low risk demand. And if there's a surge, the Navy wants more ships now. It has the money now. They're like, well, guess what? I might just want to stretch that market out for another 5 years and not significantly increase demand. And it's the risk profile, logical risk profile, that drives them to do that. It just doesn't serve the warfighter needs.
Yeah, and you in the article you put that in terms of putting demand in back order, right? So I'm not going to surge to build 2 DDGs in my yard next year. I'm going to continue to build 1 or 1.5 per year, and that additional order is going to go on back order, so that I know I've got business 4, 5, 6 years from now, not just next year.
Right. And it's not just naval shipbuilding. Boeing and Airbus do the exact same thing in commercial airplanes. They put the order, Boeing's got an 8-9 year backlog. They could increase production if they wanted, but it's a cyclical business historically. They don't want to do that. Again, it's a very logical decision, unless we can lower the risk profile in other ways. And frankly, the best way for me to lower the risk profile would be to have the ability to provide reliable demand signals to industry. Unfortunately, you've got a 2-year budgeting cycle. Maybe in a good year, you can get a 5-year multiple year procurement. You got a congressional cycle that goes back and forth. It's really tough for our nation to send the right demand signals to industry.
Right. And in the meantime, the background threat has changed. The Chinese have engaged in a very rapid naval buildup, but also they've become the world's #1 merchant ship builder. And there are economies of scale that help each other there. If you can build a lot of commercial ships, you also have a workforce that can then turn to building naval ships, et cetera. So, all right. Second question I wanted to ask you is, so you said, Congolium used to own
Bath Iron Works.
Bath Iron Works, right. So who owns the shipyards now? Who are the owners of those shipbuilding companies, and what do they want?
So it's interesting. It's a useful question because it really illustrates some of the differences here. So when we think of the naval shipbuilders, I put them in 2 categories. There's the big traditional shipbuilders. So Newport News and Ingalls are owned by Huntington Ingalls, publicly traded company, owned in large part by mutual funds, some private investors who have a very specific set of aspirations for what they want Huntington Ingalls management to do, which is basically send me low risk cash. NASSCO, Bath Iron Works, Electric Boat, owned by General Dynamics, not as a pure defense company as Huntington Ingalls. They also own Gulfstream. They do a bunch of business jet services kind of stuff, but still primarily a U.S. defense player. Investors have the same expectation: send us cash. There are 2 smaller naval shipbuilders that are worth mentioning. Austal is foreign owned. It's owned by an Australian company. Its ownership structure looks very different than the U.S. shipbuilders, U.S. owned shipbuilders. It has a owner who owns 10% of the company individually. There's a small set of Australian investors and families that owns another quarter of it. About a third of the company is owned by investors that can have a simple phone call and discuss what they want to do with the company.
Hmm.
And it tends to think much longer term. If there's criticism of also from investors, the individual investors, is you're over-investing. You're buying up all these businesses, you're building a new shipyard here, but that's what the core management and ownership wants to do, and they get their way. The other company is Marinette Marine, which again, foreign owned by Fincantieri in Italy. It's a very different ownership structure still. It's 75% owned by the Italian government. It is not doing share buybacks, neither is Alstom. It's investing heavily in growing its global shipbuilding business, including in the US. So it really points out the importance of the ownership structure relating to the types of incentives and objectives that companies will pursue. Closely held, privately owned, government-owned entities can behave one way. Big US publicly traded companies can behave a different way. I think that illustrates the importance of the ownership structure in driving behavior.
Yeah, that's a good point. So I'm reminded, so a month ago, we were out at West in San Diego. A year ago at West in San Diego, Secretary Del Toro, then Secretary of the Navy Del Toro, made a lot of news because he was pretty angry, and he was vocally and publicly angry with shipbuilders, with defense contractors, but especially with shipbuilders, because they weren't adding capacity fast enough, right? They weren't responding to his demand signal or the Navy's demand signal to build ships, to ramp up the production. Particularly, I think he mentioned the Virginia-class submarines, and because of the AUKUS deal and wanting to go from one submarine to really 2.5 to 3 per year, and get there as fast as possible. And I when I read your article 6 or 8 months after hearing Secretary Del Toro speak, I was like, I wish Del Toro had read this article, right? Because it just
I was asked to go to the Pentagon.
Square the circle a lot,
I spent a lot of time at the Pentagon in the couple of months after he made those comments, doing some very detailed presentations on how cash flow works in the defense industry and why it's happening. And I think his comments were very well intended.
Yeah.
But the reality is the owners are going to suit their objectives. And if they're not aligned, you should not expect the outcome necessarily to be aligned with what you do. So I appreciate his earnest intentions here, but I don't think it was really going to shift behavior. I'm looking at the 2024 financial results right now. They're coming out day by day, and my analysis suggests that the share buyback and dividend behavior may have diminished marginally, but it's still a primary objective of these companies to return cash to shareholders, as the shareholders insist.
Right. Yeah. So there's 2 charts in the article. You look at both General Dynamics and HII and how they used cash over the last couple of years, right? And about more than half went to stock buybacks and dividends. So that's your point about, the investors. So the mutual funds that invest in these companies, the individuals who invest in these companies, that's what they want, right? They invest in HII or General Dynamics to pay a dividend. I own some Coca-Cola stock because it's a good dividend stock, right? I also own some Nvidia because it's the one that's grown in market cap, 10x, right? But my Coca-Cola, when Nvidia had a very bad day the last couple of days, yesterday, my Coca-Cola stock doesn't let me down, right? And so this is kind of where HII and GD fall in investors' thoughts. Is okay. This is a company that's going to be around for a while because it does something that is needed by the country, but it's going to kick back a 3 or 4% dividend every year, and I can sort of rely on that, right?
Right, and I mentioned in the article what happened when HII was reviewed by one of the very popular investment websites, which they got excoriated because they were planning to invest. And the investment analyst said, that's not a good thing for investors. I don't want you to invest. And, so you really feel for the management in these places, because I've known a lot of them, and at their heart, they would like nothing better to do than support the mission of the U.S. Navy and the warfighter and shipbuilding. But they have this conflict in what they're being asked to do. The The broader message, though, if you sit back, the response you'll get from the executives is, well, I need to do this to meet the shareholder needs, but my stock's a bargain. I can buy my stock and give the money back, and it's a cheap investment. But what that tells me is we've got a corporate management team, bright people, motivated people, that can't find sufficient ways to create value in their existing businesses. And so rather than use their talents to say, hey, here's how I can revolutionize shipbuilding, or even, broaden into related commercial markets, they're effectively saying, I don't have any options. I can't think of any smart investment plays in my core business. So I'm going to give the money back to you because you have smarter ability to make those investment plays. And that sort of worries me a little bit. I'd like to see a more aggressive challenge to themselves about how to invest in their core businesses to make them more profitable, faster growing, more sustainable.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. I'll also point out, and I'm trying to say this without pointing fingers, but a reality now for the past at least decade is that the congressional budget process has always devolved down to continuing resolutions. And that is that's a self-inflicted wound. When Congress doesn't pass a budget on time, even if the budget eventually will call for a new aircraft carrier start or buying 2 submarines or whatever it is, that contract for that new ship or that new weapon system or new submarine can't actually start until we have a real budget, not a continuing resolution. So,
Right.
so CRs, that's got to cause a lot of gray hair among the management of the companies that are trying to build ships, right? If they know what the Navy wants, the Navy puts it into its budget requests, and then Congress can't actually pass that budget on time. There can be a time lag in when the work can actually get started on that new ship, program, submarine,
Right.
whatever it is, correct?
Yeah, and I promise not to point a finger. And part of the reason is if I was going to point a finger, I would need 535 of them to point. At the end of the day, the demand signals, the Navy sets forward its objectives, but it comes out of Congress. And the continuing resolutions are just the worst case example of the inability of the nation through its representatives to create a demand signal long term to encourage this investment.
That's consistent.
The money is there. Much more than it was a decade ago. You commented after 9/11, there was no bump for the Navy after 9/11, but there is now. The problem is industry still won't invest unless they have confidence that's going to be out there for a while. I mean, the Nimitz aircraft carrier class will be a 90-year product life cycle from when we start thinking about the design to when the last one comes out of the fleet. So the decisions you're asking a company to make have a time horizon almost of a century. Yet you're going to motivate that by a continuing resolution. It's a real challenge, and I don't have an answer for that one, unfortunately.
What and your article gets to this. There's a number of really, I think, pretty solid recommendations in it. So what can the Navy or Congress do about procurement strategies that would allow shipbuilders to potentially attract more risk-seeking investors?
Well, I'd actually would position it 2 ways. One is there things, so the risk in a shipbuilder exists on 3 levels. There's the market risk. I don't know how many ships I'm going to be asked to build, but then there's operational risk. I have a fixed cost business. There's nothing sadder than an empty shipyard. I've seen a lot of them in my career. It's just tragic. The facilities are still there. The retiree pension benefits are still there. The costs don't all go away. And then there's financial risk. And the financial risk they've taken care of. They don't load up their balance sheet with debt. There's not much you can do about operational risk unless the government owns the assets. If industry owns the assets, you're transferring all that fixed cost risk to the shareholders. So there's a scenario here around GoCos that could potentially address some of that problem. It's a radical idea. It's how we build nuclear weapons.
Spell out that acronym, GoCo.
GoCo, I'm sorry. The government would own the assets. So it's government owned, contractor operated. It's where you hire a management team. And as I said, it's how we build nuclear weapons. It's how we develop nuclear reactors for submarines and carriers. It's a real model that exists. So you can try to solve that, which leaves you back to the market risk. And the way to solve market risk is long-term demand signals. And we've talked a little bit about the difficulty in trying to make that happen. Now, the Navy doesn't escape all responsibility here. If you project a ship class that turns out to be not properly budgeted at the outset, not properly spec'd at the outset, not sufficiently stable in its requirement specification at the outset, you run into problems. You run into problems, Congress reacts. Congress cuts the budget, cuts the volumes. So everybody has to behave a little bit differently here. And I think a more reliable ship specification process in the Navy would help Congress, if it chose to do so, have a better demand signal for industry, then industry can react. So lots of things have to come into play. I mean, there's no silver bullet here to fix the problem.
I'm reminded that when the Secretary Designee of the Navy, Mr. Phelan, testified, his hearings, his confirmation hearings were this week. He mentioned the problems with the Constitution class frigate, which is being built, the first one at least, is supposed to be built up at Marinette Shipyard, Fincantieri Marinette up in Wisconsin. They've had some problems there. But part of those problems, I think, gets to a point you just said, which is that the Navy, when it let the contract for that frigate program, what it did was it supposedly, allegedly, was going to accept the design from the Italian-French Frem class frigate, and those two navies, the Italian Navy, the French Navy, have had those classes of ships in their navies for more than a decade now, right? And so the U.S.-based Constellation class frigate was supposed to be at least 85% based on that Frem design. And so it would have appeared 4 or 5 years ago when that decision was made that the design was pretty well locked down. But then the Navy, went through the design and said, yeah, this Italian, the European design really isn't up to our standards in a whole bunch of different places. And so the most recent reporting from our USNI news team was that instead of being 85% common, it's now like a 15% commonality with the French Italian design. So that gets to your point about the risk that the customer doesn't really know what they want, right? Doesn't lock down the product requirements early enough and then stick to those without sort of constantly upping and changing the requirements, moving the goalposts, if you will. Retired Vice Admiral Tom Moore, also in the February issue, former NAVSEA commander, he pointed the blame at himself, at the Navy, in that role, that the Navy has had too many examples of requirements creep, where they just let the requirements continue to grow without locking down a design and saying, no, this is it, now build to it, right?
So we've seen this story before, though. I mean, those of us who've been around, none of this is a surprise.
Right.
At one point, we were going to adapt an Italian UK helicopter design to carry the president. And it was going to be inexpensive, and they could throw it into the system, and suddenly, it's totally inadequate. So I don't know whether the issue was the false hope of being able to use a foreign design product or what happened afterwards. I would almost shift the emphasis, though, from exploiting foreign design capability to trying to exploit foreign manufacturing expertise. While it may not be the right design, the Koreans know a lot about shipbuilding that we could benefit from. The Italians build some very complicated ships besides Navy ships that we could learn from. The difficulty is if you try to bring that capability to the U.S., you run into all of the legitimately established but onerous requirements around foreign ownership, foreign talent coming to the U.S. I've been involved in this personally in another area, and it's taken us 2 years to be able to be serious about building a factory in the U.S. to supply critical things that the Department of Defense needs. Just going, 6 different cabinet departments, 7 different parts of the Department of Defense, all of whom have a veto. So I would like to suggest we think carefully about bringing in some of the manufacturing capability that exists outside the U.S. defense establishment today, for some bold thinking and new ideas. Some of that would be overseas.
Yeah, and that gets to an idea that also Secretary Del Toro talked about that in his last 2 years in office, where he visited Japanese and Korean shipbuilders, right, and talked about, would it be possible to build part of the ships, build the hull, mechanical, electrical in a foreign yard, or at least some of them, and then bring them to the United States for fitting out. Anyway, so a lot of these ideas have been sort of bandied about at different levels, I think, of seriousness. But your article does touch on that there is capacity outside the United States in our allies and partners that perhaps while if there were a consistent demand signal and U.S. Shipbuilders built up their capacity, that in the meantime you could augment that capacity with foreign yards for some period of time, right?
And we have a test case here with Hanwha in Korea acquiring Philly Shipyard in Philadelphia.
Right.
And whether or not there's an opportunity to bring some real new thinking about manufacturing and construction technology from the Koreans to a U.S. shipyard, which used to be foreign owned anyway.
At our Defense Forum Washington discussion on shipbuilding, that was at the Spy Museum in early December. I'm blanking on his name, but the president, the U.S. president of the Fincantieri Marinette Marine, who's a retired Navy captain who was a surface warfarer, and then he commanded Naval Surface Warfare Center Carderock, which is the main headquarters of all the naval architects in the U.S. Navy. But he pointed to Fincantieri, and he said Fincantieri, as a large shipbuilding company that, as you pointed out, does make some very complicated ships, namely cruise ships, which have a lot of requirements because of passenger safety and all those kinds of things. He said that the Marinette Yard had adopted some capabilities and some technologies that came from the Italian shipbuilding company, right? That they brought those capabilities. Panel rolling was one, or panel shaping was one of them. And we actually have a picture of that in the February yard. I reached out to him and said, hey, could we get some of the pictures of what you talked about at that Defense Forum Washington? So I think that's a good point. Another point you bring up, another recommendation, is the possibility of going private. So I guess this gets back to the government-owned, commercially operated, but talk about that a little bit more.
So there's no requirement that a defense contractor be publicly traded as a company. There are large privately owned companies around. One of the biggest is SpaceX, which is worth significantly more than all the defense companies in the country put together. There's Anduril, which has come from basically nowhere to being a big defense contractor in 10 years.
Also private.
There's also privately owned. There's privately owned companies like General Atomics, Sierra Nevada, who have had some of the more radical ideas. If you go back in my youth, there was Hughes Aircraft, which was privately owned, by Medical Institute, which developed many of the critical technologies around radar and spacecraft and thermal imaging and such back in the 50s, 60s, 70s, missiles. A privately owned company, if closely held, can take a much longer term view. It does not have to meet the quarterly expectations of Wall Street analysts. It can decide to take risk for higher return long term. If an opportunity came up for a private equity company, for example, to pick up a shipyard from one of the defense companies and run it as a closely held private company, that might work for the Navy's long-term objectives. They'll expect a return at the end of the day, but that can serve the Navy's interest as well. And there are a number of these big private equity companies that have a lot of expertise in working in the defense industry. They already own companies. They understand the process. They understand the warfighter's needs. So I would think that could be a solution. It's a little tough for the Navy itself to do that. That has to be approved by the shareholders of the company. But there might be some way of cutting a deal. I will give you a demand signal of this kind if you commit to this kind of relationship. If you allow me a seat on the board of directors, so I can at least be part of the discussions about the future of the company. These are sort of radical notions, but I think it's frankly time to think boldly about some of the radical notions.
So in that case, a group of private investors would purchase the shares of a publicly owned company now?
They could.
Okay.
Companies go private all the time.
Yep.
Or they could go to one of the existing companies and say, you know what, that shipyard, sell that shipyard to us. Keep the rest of your businesses.
Got it.
we'll pay you X billion for the shipyard, and then we'll run it. And you can then go off and take that money and give it to shareholders and make them happy, or do something else with it.
Got it.
These things do happen from time to time. Buying a big shipyard would be a relatively large one, but in the scheme of the money, there's a ton of money out there to be applied. And defense industry, we think of ourselves as this massive industry, but in the scheme of the economy as a whole, we're pretty small.
Yeah. Another recommendation that you made or possibility is just do it yourself, right? So that's the government owning shipyards and running shipyards. Right now, the four public shipyards, the naval shipyards in Pearl Harbor, in Portsmouth Naval Shipyard, et cetera, those are just repair yards. They're maintenance and repair yards. But in the past, they've actually built submarines and built surface ships, correct?
They have, for sure they did, but we really got out of that business in the 70s in terms of new construction. However, there are resources there, capabilities there. The idea of having them become part of the industrial base for manufacturing, they may not do final assembly, but can they do fabrication of modules? Can they do assembly of critical components? Maybe final assembly is a real possibility. It's not seen to be our way. We have this sense that government shouldn't be doing these things. I think the situation is sufficiently critical that it's time to test some of those conventional assumptions about what we can do and not do. There'll be a response that comes out, well, the government is inept, it can't possibly manage anything. Not if that's the case, why are we letting them do maintenance? And frankly, I'm not sure the track record of the Navy getting what the Navy needs is so strong today that we just ought to assume the future has to look like it does today. But it would be a fairly radical thing for the U.S. to do. I think it's time to consider radical options.
Yeah. Interesting points. Well, we're running a little short on time, Marty. This has been a great conversation. Any saved rounds or final words?
I just would echo what I just said. We need no ships. The support and the money is there. Unless we send better demand signals or we change the motivations of the owners, all the other good ideas won't be fully implemented. And it's not going to solve the problem in and of itself, but I think it's absolutely part of the solution. Yeah,
it's certainly a multifaceted problem. It is a big problem. The Navy has not been able to move the needle and get above 300 ships, despite stated objectives from multiple administrations to do so. It is time for probably some radical or new ideas. Yeah, definitely. So my guest today has been Marty Bollinger. He's a business consultant, management professor at University of Virginia's Darden School of Business, and a naval historian, a multi-time Naval Institute author of naval history, proceedings, and books. His article in the February issue of Proceedings is titled "Shareholder Interests Are at Odds with Navy Needs." It is eye-opening. I recommend it to everybody. Marty, thanks for your time. Thanks for writing for Proceedings, and look forward to being with you again soon.
Thank you, Bill. Appreciate the opportunity.
All right. Well, save the date. The Naval Institute's 152nd annual meeting will be held on the 14th of May in our Jack C. Taylor Conference Center in Annapolis. Always a great event. Put it on your calendar now, 14 May. Usually starts about 1600. Spoiler alert, we're going to have a shipbuilding panel as the sort of highlight of the afternoon. So you'll, in addition to hearing how the Naval Institute is doing, and we'll be recognizing our authors of the year and some essay contest winners. We'll be talking about shipbuilding at our annual meeting. More details coming soon. This episode is brought to you by Booz Allen, delivering outcomes with speed for the nation's most critical defense priorities. Work with solution engineers who use AI, cyber, and quantum to help warfighters collaborate faster with allies and partners from the open seas to the edge of space. Learn more at boozallen.com/defense. And until next episode, remember, victory begins at the Naval Institute.